agricultural sector could take a 39 billion rand export hit as a result of the coronavirus, dampening demand from Asian countries. The Agricultural Business Chamber has warned, well, South African products sold into Asian countries include wool, fruit, grains, beverages, vegetables, and red meat. In all Asians, which is at the epicenter of this particular outbreak. It accounts for 25% of South Africa's agricultural export. Here to unpack what this means for the industry, I'm joined by Dr Sifiso Ntombela, Chief Economist at the National Agricultural Marketing Council. It's good to have you, Doc.
Good to have you there.
Is the agricultural sector in recession? I mean, it's mathematical. Of course it is, right? Because quarter on quarter since the start of 2019, it's just been a retraction and a retraction. The last time we saw a rise was in 2018. Even then, marginal 7.9% rise. So it's very bad.
Yes, it is. And I think one of the things that you should understand is that even though we haven't seen any growth in the agricultural sector itself, but it tells us one thing, that it still play a very critical role in cushioning our economy, because we have seen in most cases when the numbers comes out of GDP and agriculture is on the downside, it tends to have that strong knock-on effect on the economy itself. But I think it's also important to put these things in perspective. The agricultural sector as a whole, it's basically at a tipping point. And it's one of the sectors like any other one, that's like manufacturing, that is dual in nature. And you have very strong, vibrant commercial sector, but you have this other emerging sector which still have a lot of untapped potential that is not necessarily coming through into the sector. Now, what has been the case is that because of the commercial sector that is basically driving this agricultural economy has been in the tipping point, and there's a very narrow margin for any additional growth, is that every external shock that comes in, it tends to have a very big impact on it.
Right.
Now, we see with the coronavirus now in terms of which is going to affect our export market. But you remember the whole of last year, one of the biggest things that has been facing the sector is these outbreaks, trade distorting outbreaks, like the foot and mouth disease in the animal sector, which basically affected your wool and other cloven hooven animals.
Right. But also the pattern has changed. I mean, previously you would see a drought and the next rainfall season there will be a quick recovery. But I think we're seeing more and more drier periods, and therefore the recovery is also not as quick as it would have been in previous times.
Certainly. You're seeing more and more consistency, very right in that, in terms of the dry conditions. But also, even when we have the rains, you tend to find them in a very odd time, not usually the early days. We've seen this year where they come in very late, not necessarily coming in when you need those plantation part of it. But all this, what it does, it tells us that maybe it's time to start talking about the structural changes in the sector. And it talks about also how do we reposition the sector in the changing climate conditions, because we can clearly tell that there's evidence that the climate is changing. Right. Now, when I talk about the need to start looking broader, because all these are short-term impact, but if you put them together, they start showing a long-term impact that we start having to see. If we don't pay attention closely, we might find ourselves in a...
So the level of risk in farming is quite high at this particular point, and you're suggesting that there are interventions that can be looked at in the immediate. And one of the things that is talked about is technology. For example, technology that is able to respond, for example, to shorter periods. So seeds that are able to actually produce crop much quicker than it's actually taking right now.
That is part of what I'm talking about. But even that, it will still give us short-term benefit of it. We need to really relook at the whole structure, because if you've seen in the last 24 years, the gain that we've had was a function of technology and increase in yield and so forth. So even if we concentrate on that technology and precision farming, it will give us that marginal growth, but it's not going to unlock the bigger growth that we need. And the bigger growth that I'm talking about is one that is sitting in the areas where we had not tapped, in the former homeland areas. And bringing in those new players.
I want you to talk a little bit more about this. So let me take a break and come back. Dr Sifiso Ntombela, Chief Economist at the National Agricultural Marketing Council, with us. When we come back, we'll wrap up this conversation with him. Welcome back. Still with Dr. Sifiso Ntombela, Chief Economist at the National Agricultural Marketing Council. What will drive the recovery and growth in the agricultural sector? Following, of course, a decline that we have been seeing, all in all, a decrease of 6.9% in 2019. That is quite hectic. It's a big drop. So, technology, crop breeders, we need to harness our water harvesting infrastructure. We need to use water efficiently. But you're saying there is a rural market that is not being tapped at this point.
I want to give you an example, and I want to stick with the story of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
And one of the things which it's going to do, we know very well that once the medical field has found and they combated the disease, one thing which is a long-term impact of the disease, what it will do in the Chinese market specifically, is that it's going to start changing the consumption pattern of the Chinese market. Yeah. You're going to be seeing those shift from the wild animals now being having a bad perception in the consumers. Now, guess what these consumers are going to do? Because China, we know, it's bringing in about 30 million people every year into the middle class. Now, what is that middle class going to consume in the next 3 or 4 years' time?
Crop.
It's going to start producing crops. It's going to start also eating our cattle. It's going to start eating beef and mutton. And who's better positioned to supply that? It's South Africa. So we need to start saying that with the foreseeable changes in the market, in the international market, which we can supply relatively easily because we have the competitive advantage of it. How do we start unlocking the 40% animals that is sitting on the black farmers in the Eastern Cape, KZN, Mpumalanga, and other outscale of it? Of course, we still have to get all those animals that are sitting with our commercial farmers in the Free State and so forth. And what that does, it starts saying to us, we should be starting now to say we put our biosecurity measures and export systems in place so that we can be able to service that market. That's what I talk about, because we are able then to unlock that growth that is sitting there. With those animals that you can supply that meat, it will require more grain to feed those animals, which will start then using this unutilized land to produce some of the grains we can feed those animals.
But what came out of the Black Business Council, especially from the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, is that question of land, to say, allow black people to own land. They are capable. We need to get rid of the stigma that black people are not capable to own land.
Absolutely. I mean, there's ample evidence that farmers, and of all them, they have the capabilities, just need an exposure. And this talks back into the systems that you have to put in place to enable them to do those things. And we talk about in terms of the land, but over and above, once you have access into the land, what are the post-settlement support mechanisms that you have to put in place? Now, we have been discussing all those things, and we have established that there is enough policy space available to do such things. It is a matter of just designing them and making them efficient and affordable so that they can access them easily. But all those things start by developing your market. Because you don't want to put in the new product in the market and you end up depressing the prices. Yeah. And we have seen that over the last 25 years with the fruit industry, that we were able to develop deep sea market. And we could do the same for the livestock, we could do the same for the grains, which will enable those farmers that they were talking about to participate fully into the market.
Dr. Ntombela, we could have this conversation the whole night. I appreciate the time. Thanks for coming.
No, thanks very much.
Dr. Sifiso Ntombela, Chief Economist at the National Agricultural Marketing Council. They're looking at the agricultural economy for us. Well,